إن القريرة عينه عبد خشي الإله وعيشه قصد. إن القريرة عينه عبد خشي الإله.
My dear brothers, there is no doubt that we are living in a time of fitna. We are living in a time of trials and tribulations. And there are no other people to look up to better than the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. And we look back at how they dealt with fitna. And we all know that the greatest fitna to ever befall the ummah is the death of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But after that, the Sahaba faced another fitna, and that was the assassination of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. Ali ibn Abi Talib climbed the minbar, he climbed the pulpit for the first time as Khalifa, and he addressed the people. And he said, "O people, O believers, you are in need of a man of action and not a man of words." My brothers, have you ever stopped and wondered why the nusra of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't reached us yet? The help of Allah, which Allah promised the believers, why is it being delayed? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see action from you and I. Maryam alayhi salam was heavily pregnant with Isa alayhi salam. And she was scared, she was in fear, she withdrew herself from the people and went to a place far away. She isolated herself. She was in fear, she was hungry. And despite that, what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? After أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَهُزِّي إِلَيْكِ بِجِذْعِ النَّخْلَةِ تُسَاقِطْ عَلَيْكِ رُطَبًا جَنِيًّا. And shake towards you the trunk of the palm tree, and it will drop upon you ripe, fresh dates. What about Musa alayhi salam, my dear brothers? He was besieged, he was trapped, he was cornered by the army of Fir'aun. He had the ocean in front of him, and he had the army of Fir'aun advancing towards him and his people from behind. What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? He said, فَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى مُوسَىٰ أَنِ اضْرِبْ بِعَصَاكَ الْبَحْرِ. He said, then we inspired Musa alayhi salam, strike the sea with your stick. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala split the ocean. Each portion of the ocean was as tall as was towering mountains. And also we have another example, my brothers, in Ayyub alayhi salam, when he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cure him of his illness. What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell Ayyub alayhi salam? He says, "Urqud birijlik, هذا مغتسل بارد وشراب." So he was told, strike the ground with your foot. This is a spring for a cool bath and drink. You see, my brothers, these are great examples from the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have easily provided dates for Maryam alayhi salam. He could have easily split the ocean for Musa alayhi salam. He could have easily cured the illness of Ayyub alayhi salam. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see effort. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to see action. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see obedience. And He wants to see sincerity from His slaves. And then, and only then, when you show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala your sincerity and your obedience and action, and that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will descend His nusra upon you. And yet, we see the ummah complaining, where is the nusra of Allah? Why hasn't it descended yet? And this is the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you shall receive nusra. But has the ummah prayed salah the way it should be prayed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withheld His nusra? Has the ummah paid its zakat properly, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withheld His nusra? Has the ummah practiced al-wala and al-bara properly? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withheld His nusrah? Has the ummah loved Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger more than themselves, more than their families, more than their wealth? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala withheld His nusrah? We have this warped perception, this twisted, sick mentality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala owes us, that He is obliged to send His nusrah upon you. Know, my brothers, that there are conditions to receive the nusrah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not that you sit there and do nothing, live a relaxed life full of enjoyment, and then expect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you or to descend His nusrah upon you. You learn no deen, you don't know tawheed, you don't know al-wala wal-bara, and you expect Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the King of all kings. He is the Lord of the worlds. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not obliged to help you. We have to show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala why He needs to help His ummah. Your power and your numbers do not matter to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can be 2 billion Muslims with all the power of the world. That doesn't matter in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What matters is your quality and not your quantity. And how many times have we seen this in our history? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, كَم مِّن فِئَةٍ قَلِيلَةٍ غَلَبَتْ فِئَةً كَثِيرَةً بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. How many a small group has defeated a large group by the permission of Allah? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with the patient. In the time of Khalid ibn Walid radiyallahu anhu, in the battle of Yarmouk, one of the most famous battles and the biggest battles for the Muslims. After that day, the Romans never stepped foot in the Arabian Peninsula. The Muslims were 41,000 and the Romans were 140,000. Khalid bin Walid was checking his men. He was going through the ranks of the Mujahideen, increasing their morale. And he walked past this young Mujahid. And this young Mujahid, he saw the Roman army and he was in awe. He was in awe because of their numbers, because of the weapons that they had. And what did this young Mujahid said? He said, look how many are the Romans and how few are the Muslims. Khalid ibn al-Walid radiyallahu anhu said, he says, no, don't say that. Say how many are the Muslims and how few are the Romans. Because weakness comes from being forsaken by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you lose Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you lose tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you lose everything. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. After the battle of the Murtaddin, the battle of the apostates, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu told Khalid ibn Walid, now the Persians are waiting. My brothers, I want you to think for a moment, who were the Persians at that time? The Persians were one of the biggest superpowers of that time. The biggest superpower. They had all the artillery, they had all the advanced weapons, they had men, they had everything. And we were still a new Khilafah in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu told Khalid, go and deal with them. And whoever of your men want to rest and go home because they fought many battles, the battle of the Murtaddin, tell them to go home, it's okay, they can go to their families. So Khalid ibn Walid he made the announcement to his men. He had 13,000 soldiers. He made the announcement and 11,000 men raised their hand. They wanted to go home and rest. What does that leave with Khalid ibn Walid? 2,000 men. Khalid ibn Walid, he wrote a letter to Abu Bakr. He says, "O Khalifatu Rasulillah, I am only left with 2,000 men. Please send me reinforcements." What did Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu do? He sent him one man. And he is no other than Al-Qaqa ibn Amr. And the Sahaba were shocked. "Oh, Abu Bakr, what are you doing? He is down 11,000 men and you only return him with one?" What did Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu say? And this is, I just want you to understand how heavy the men were back in those days. Their value. He says, the ranks that has the likes of Al-Qaqa ibn Amr in their army will not be forsaken by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One man equal to 11,000 men. These men relied on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They implemented the Quran the way it was. 2,000 men took on a superpower. Every single one of those men had reliance on Allah. They did not rely on foreign countries. They did not rely on weapons. They relied on the maker and the sustainer of this world. The maker of those enemies. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You do your part. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you. You do your part with whatever you have. And then you rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My dear brothers, we do not want to be like the people of Musa, where they wanted everything handed to them on a gold platter, without any effort, without any action. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded them to take action, and then Jerusalem will be theirs. And what did they say to Musa alayhi salam? They said, "Go, both you and your Lord, and fight." And we are saying right here. And because of their rebellion, and because they did not want to put in effort and show action to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbid them Jerusalem for 40 years as a punishment. And look at us today. We have become people of words and no action. How many tahajjud, how many qiyam al-layl do we raise our hands and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for victory? In front of the Kaaba, how many Muslims ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for victory? A'udhu billah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot see his slaves? He does not hear his slaves? A'udhu billah, he turned back on his promise? No, because we have become people of words and no action. My brothers, I remind myself first, before any one of you, that you do your bit and you strive for the sake of Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will handle the rest. One of the conditions for dua is that you have to strive to achieve it. You do not make your dua and sit down and do nothing. You ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for rizq. You ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for wealth. You go out there and you work, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will handle the rest. You show Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you are putting in an effort, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees. He is the all-seer, and He will provide for you from places that you do not know. Allahumma a'izz al-Islam wal-Muslimin wa adhill al-shirka wal-mushrikeen wa dammir a'da'aka a'da' ad-din. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. قوموا لصلاتكم يرحمكم الله.
القريرة عينه عبد خشي الإله وعيشه قصد